When we think about ancient civilizations, our minds jump to the obvious ones. Egypt with its pyramids and pharaohs, Mesopotamia with its ziggurats and cuneiform tablets, Greece with its philosophers and marble temples, Rome with its legions and aqueducts. These are the civilizations that dominate textbooks, that fill museum exhibits, that capture popular imagination with their drama, their wars, their larger-than-life rulers whose names echo through millennia. But there was another civilization, equally ancient, equally sophisticated, and in many ways more remarkable than any of these. A civilization that sprawled across what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, covering an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. A civilization of planned cities with sophisticated drainage systems, standardized weights and measures, and architectural precision that wouldn't be matched in the region for thousands of years. A civilization that flourished for nearly 1,000 years, trading with distant lands, building monuments, creating art, and supporting a population that may have reached 5 million people at its peak. And yet, this civilization left no temples covered in hieroglyphics, no tombs filled with treasure, no epic poems carved into stone, no dramatic accounts of kings and conquests. What they left behind was something far more mundane, and in its own way, far more fascinating. They left behind the everyday, the ordinary, the boring details of how people actually lived, day to day, in one of the ancient world's most successful and yet most mysterious societies. This is the Indus Valley civilization, also called the Harappan civilization after Harappa, one of its major cities. It emerged around 3300 BCE, reached its mature phase around 2600 BCE, and declined around 1900 BCE. For nearly 1,000 years, millions of people lived in its cities and towns, going about their daily business, raising families, working, eating, sleeping, worrying about the harvest and the weather and their neighbors, living lives that were simultaneously completely different from ours and yet recognizably human in their fundamental concerns. Tonight, we're going to explore what daily life was actually like in the Indus Valley. Not the grand narratives of rise and fall that historians love to construct, not the theories about why the civilization declined or where its people came from. Just the ordinary, repetitive, unglamorous reality of existing in this place, during this time, doing the things that needed doing to survive and maybe find some small measure of comfort or meaning in the process. We're going to walk through a typical day in an Indus Valley city. We're going to examine the houses people lived in, the food they ate, the clothes they wore, the work they did. We're going to look at how they organized their cities, how they managed water and waste, how they conducted trade, how they raised their children. We're going to explore the small details that made up the texture of daily existence, the things that consumed people's time and attention, the mundane realities that rarely make it into history books, but that actually constituted the bulk of human experience. Because that's what history actually is. When you strip away the mythology and drama, it's not primarily about kings and battles and grand moments. It's about millions of ordinary people doing ordinary things, day after day, year after year, generation after generation. Getting up in the morning, going to work, preparing meals, maintaining homes, dealing with neighbors, worrying about children, getting sick, getting better, getting old. The Indus Valley people did all of these things. And somehow, despite leaving behind no written records we can read, no grand monuments proclaiming their greatness, they managed to create archaeological evidence detailed enough that we can reconstruct, at least partially, what their daily lives looked like. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's travel back more than 4,000 years to the cities of the Indus Valley, to the streets and houses and workshops where people lived lives that were both impossibly distant from ours and yet, in their fundamental humanity, surprisingly familiar. The Indus Valley civilization didn't announce itself dramatically. There was no conquest, no sudden eruption into history, no founding myth about divine intervention or heroic leaders. It emerged gradually, organically, from earlier farming communities that had been developing in the region for millennia. Small villages grew into towns, towns grew into cities. Population increased, social complexity increased, technology improved, trade networks expanded, and eventually, around 2600 BCE, the civilization reached what archaeologists call its mature phase, when the distinctive features that characterized Indus Valley culture were fully developed and consistently expressed across the entire region. The geography shaped everything about how these people lived. The Indus River, one of the great rivers of Asia, flowed from the Himalayas through what is now Pakistan, creating a vast floodplain of extraordinarily fertile soil. Each year, predictably, the river would flood, depositing nutrient-rich silt across the fields, creating agricultural conditions as favorable as those in Egypt or Mesopotamia. This agricultural abundance supported the civilization's growth, providing enough surplus food to sustain large urban populations and specialized craftspeople who didn't farm, but instead made pottery, wove cloth, carved seals, and performed other skilled labor. But the Indus Valley environment was also challenging in ways that shaped daily life profoundly. The summer heat was brutal, regularly exceeding 40 degrees Celsius, over 100 Fahrenheit. The monsoon rains, when they came, could be torrential, flooding streets and fields, making outdoor work impossible for days or weeks. The winter brought relief from the heat, but also dust storms and occasional cold snaps that could damage crops. Disease was endemic. Malaria, dysentery, and various parasitic infections were constant threats in a climate that favored disease vectors and in cities where people lived in close quarters. The civilization's extent was remarkable. At its peak, it covered about 1.25 million square kilometers, an area larger than Western Europe. Cities and towns dotted the landscape from the Arabian Sea coast to the foothills of the Himalayas, from what is now eastern Afghanistan to the Indian state of Gujarat. This wasn't a single unified empire in the traditional sense. There's no evidence of a supreme ruler, no palaces that clearly served as royal residences, no monuments dedicated to glorifying kings or military victories. Instead, the Indus Valley civilization seems to have been a network of city-states, or perhaps a loose confederation, unified not by conquest or centralized political authority, but by shared culture, shared technology, shared standards. The cities look remarkably similar to each other. They used the same system of weights and measures. They made pottery and tools using the same techniques. They built their houses and public buildings following similar plans. They used the same distinctive seals for trade and administration. This standardization across such a vast area, maintained for centuries without apparent military coercion, is one of the civilization's most puzzling and impressive features. The major cities, places like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, house populations of perhaps 30,000 to 50,000 people, enormous by Bronze Age standards. Smaller towns and villages dotted the countryside, ranging from a few hundred residents to several thousand. The total population of the civilization at its peak may have reached 5 million, possibly more. That's an astonishing number of people to organize, feed, and coordinate without, apparently, the elaborate bureaucratic structures that characterized contemporary civilizations in Egypt and Mesopotamia. How they accomplished this organization is one of the great mysteries of the Indus Valley civilization. We have no readable texts explaining their political system, their religious beliefs, their social structure, or their historical narrative. The Indus script, found on seals and pottery, remains undeciphered despite more than a century of scholarly effort. We don't know what language these people spoke. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know their gods' names or their kings' names, assuming they had kings at all. Everything we know about them comes from archaeology, from the physical remains of their cities and artifacts, from the traces they left in the ground. This absence of textual evidence makes the Indus Valley people perpetually mysterious, frustratingly opaque, but it also, in a strange way, makes them more purely archaeological, more directly knowable through the material record of daily life. We can't be distracted by royal propaganda, by religious mythology, by the literate elite's version of events. We're forced to focus on what people actually did, as evidenced by what they built, made, used, and discarded. And what they built, made, and used tells a story of remarkably sophisticated urban planning, impressive technological achievement, extensive trade networks, and daily lives organized around agriculture, craft production, commerce, and the maintenance of extraordinarily well-planned cities. The cities are perhaps the most impressive and revealing aspect of Indus Valley civilization. They weren't organic growths that sprawled chaotically over time, accumulating layers of houses and streets in confused tangles like many ancient cities. They were planned, deliberately designed, laid out according to consistent principles that governed everything from street widths to building heights to drainage systems. Walking through an Indus Valley city, assuming you could travel back in time to do so, you'd be struck immediately by the order, the regularity, the sense that someone had thought very carefully about how a city should be organized. The cities were typically built on elevated platforms, raised above the surrounding floodplain to protect against the annual floods. These platforms, constructed from millions of mud bricks, required enormous labor to build and maintain, but they kept the cities dry even when surrounding fields were underwater. The platforms also provided symbolic elevation, making the cities visible from considerable distances, announcing their presence and importance to travelers and traders approaching from across the plain. The street layout followed a grid pattern, with main streets running roughly north-south and east-west, intersecting at right angles. This grid wasn't perfect. Cities had to accommodate existing topography and earlier structures, but the overall effect was remarkably orderly. Main streets were wide, often 10 to 15 meters across, wide enough for car traffic and for people to move freely without congestion. Smaller streets and alleys branched off these main thoroughfares, leading into residential neighborhoods where the grid became less rigid but still retained a sense of organization. The standardization extended to brick sizes. Throughout the Indus Valley civilization across all its cities and towns, builders used bricks with a consistent ratio of length to width to height, roughly 4.2.1. This standardization meant that bricks made in one city could theoretically be used in another, that builders everywhere worked with familiar dimensions, that architectural techniques and knowledge could transfer seamlessly across the civilization. It seems like a small detail, but it reveals a culture with remarkably consistent standards, with some mechanism, perhaps religious, perhaps administrative, for maintaining uniformity across vast distances. Each city had distinct sections serving different purposes. The most famous and distinctive feature was what archaeologists call the citadel, a raised area, often on the western side of the city, containing large public buildings. At Mohenjo-Daro, the citadel included the famous Great Bath, a large pool surrounded by rooms and corridors with sophisticated waterproofing and drainage. The purpose of the Great Bath is debated, but it was clearly important, requiring significant resources to construct and maintain. Many archaeologists believe it had ritual significance, perhaps for purification ceremonies, though without textual evidence we can't be certain. The citadels also contained large granaries or warehouse structures, massive buildings with thick walls and ventilation systems designed to store grain. These granaries represented collective wealth, communal storage for the agricultural surplus that sustained urban populations through the year and provided buffer against harvest failures. The presence of these large storage facilities suggests some form of centralized administration, some authority responsible for collecting, storing, and distributing food, though we don't know what form that authority took. Below the citadels, in the lower town, residential neighborhoods stretched across the city. Houses lined the streets, built from the same standardized bricks, following similar plans but varying in size and complexity, depending on the wealth of the inhabitants. The residential areas also contained workshops where craftspeople made pottery, processed metals, carved beads, wove cloth, and performed the countless other specialized tasks that urban life required. The most remarkable feature of Indus Valley cities, the one that most clearly demonstrates their sophisticated engineering, was the drainage system. Every house, even modest ones, had a bathroom with a drain. These drains connected to covered drains, running along the streets, eventually leading to larger sewers that carried wastewater out of the city. The street drains were constructed from bricks, with removable covers that allowed maintenance and cleaning. Some drains had settling pits where solid waste could accumulate and be removed periodically. This level of sanitation engineering wouldn't be matched in most parts of the world for thousands of years. Ancient Rome is famous for its aqueducts and sewers, and justly so, but the Romans came 2,000 years after the Indus Valley people. Medieval European cities had nothing comparable until the modern era. The Indus Valley people, 4,000 years ago, created urban infrastructure that prioritized public health and sanitation in ways that were genuinely visionary. The drainage system required constant maintenance. Drains clogged, bricks cracked, settling pits filled up. Someone had to clean them, repair them, ensure they continued functioning. This mundane, unglamorous work was essential to the city's success. It prevented the accumulation of waste in streets. It reduced the spread of disease. It made urban life tolerable in a hot climate where standing water could quickly become a health hazard. The people who maintained the drainage system, whose names we'll never know, whose work was probably considered low status and unpleasant, were actually some of the most important individuals in the civilization, the ones who made everything else possible. The cities also had sophisticated water management systems beyond drainage. Wells provided fresh water sunk deep into the ground, lined with brick to prevent collapse, sometimes with small landing platforms at various depths where people could stand while drawing water. Major cities had hundreds of wells, ensuring that fresh water was never far from any resident. The wells were communal resources, shared by neighborhoods, places where people gathered not just to draw water, but to socialize, exchange news, arrange marriages, conduct the informal business of community life. Some cities had large reservoirs or tanks for water storage, ensuring supply during dry periods. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro was fed by a well and had sophisticated systems for filling and draining. The engineering required to maintain water levels, prevent leakage, ensure structural stability in a pool that size, all of it demonstrates remarkable technical knowledge. The cities weren't perfect. Despite the drainage systems, they must have smelled. Garbage accumulated. Animals lived in close proximity to humans. Industries like pottery firing, metalworking, and leather processing created smoke, noise, and unpleasant odors. Streets were dusty in the dry season, muddy in the wet. Buildings deteriorated and required maintenance. Floods occasionally overwhelmed defenses, damaging structures and requiring repairs. Fires were a constant danger in cities built of wood and brick, lit by oil lamps, heated by cooking fires. But compared to most ancient cities, compared even to many medieval and early modern cities, Indus Valley urban centers were remarkably livable. The planning, the infrastructure, the attention to sanitation and water management all created an urban environment that supported large populations with relatively low disease rates and high quality of life by ancient standards. The cities functioned, they worked, and they continued working, with modifications and repairs and occasional rebuilding for centuries. Understanding what this meant for daily life requires imagining yourself actually living there, waking up each morning in a brick house on a street in Mohenjo-Daro or Harappa, stepping out into a city that was simultaneously alien in its specifics and yet recognizably urban in its rhythms and patterns. A place where thousands of people lived in close proximity, pursuing their own goals and concerns, connected by invisible networks of family, commerce, and shared culture. A place where the mundane business of existence, getting food, maintaining shelter, earning a living, raising children, occupied most people's attention most of the time. That was the reality behind the impressive ruins and artifacts. That was what the civilization actually was. Not monuments and mysteries, but daily life, repeated endlessly by millions of people across centuries. Let's start with where people actually lived. The houses that sheltered them from the brutal summer heat and occasional winter cold. The private spaces where they slept, ate, raised children, stored possessions, and retreated from the public world of streets and markets. Indus Valley houses varied in size and complexity, reflecting differences in wealth and status, but they followed consistent architectural principles that reveal much about how people lived and what they valued. A typical middle-class house, the kind that would have housed an artisan family or successful merchant, was built around a central courtyard. This courtyard served as the heart of the home, the space where much of daily life occurred. It was open to the sky, providing light and ventilation, allowing smoke from cooking fires to escape, creating a semi-private outdoor space protected from the street by surrounding walls and rooms. The courtyard was where women ground grain, where children played under supervision, where families might eat meals in pleasant weather, where guests could be received without inviting them into the more private interior rooms. The rooms opened off the courtyard, their doors and windows facing inward rather than toward the street. This inward focus created privacy, screening family life from passers-by, allowing households to conduct their business away from public view. It also provided security, making houses difficult to observe or enter from outside. Street-facing walls were usually blank or had only small windows set high, while the courtyard walls had larger openings, doors and windows that allowed movement and sightlines within the domestic space. Ground floor rooms typically included storage areas, workshops if the family engaged in craft production, and service areas. A bathroom, probably the most distinctive feature of Indus Valley houses, was usually located on the ground floor, with a drain connecting to the street drainage system. The bathroom floor was waterproofed with tightly fitted bricks and sometimes with bitumen, a naturally occurring tar-like substance that sealed gaps. A terracotta pipe carried wastewater from the bathroom to the street drain, creating a proper sanitation system within each house. The bathroom probably didn't have a bathtub in the modern sense. More likely, people bathed by pouring water over themselves while standing on the brick floor, letting the water drain away. Some houses had large ceramic jars, presumably for storing bathing water. The bathroom may have also served as a latrine area, with waste either flushing into the drainage system or collected in vessels for removal. Exactly how human waste was managed isn't entirely clear from archaeological evidence, but the presence of drains and the sophistication of the overall sanitation system suggests it was handled systematically rather than simply being discarded haphazardly. Kitchens were usually separate spaces, often open air or semi-covered areas in or near the courtyard. Cooking was done over open fires, using pottery vessels placed directly on the flames or on simple hearths built from brick. The smoke from cooking fires was a constant feature of daily life, especially in the evening when households prepared meals. The smells of cooking, spices, roasting, grain, stewing vegetables and meat would have filled the courtyards and drifted into the streets, creating an aromatic atmosphere that shifted with the hours of the day. Storage was crucial in a society without refrigeration or regular markets. Houses had dedicated storage rooms, cool and dry spaces, where grain, dried legumes, oil, spices, and other supplies were kept in large pottery jars. These provisions had to last between harvests, so careful management was essential. Running out of food before the next harvest could mean starvation, or at least severe hardship. The storage rooms represented security, insurance against the inevitable variations in agricultural production and the unpredictable challenges of ancient life. Wealthier houses were larger, with more rooms, multiple courtyards, elaborate bathrooms, and more storage space. Some had staircases leading to upper floors, where additional living quarters or storage areas were located. The upper floors, built of wood and brick, would have been cooler than ground level, catching breezes and escaping some of the ground level heat and dust. Wealthy families probably slept upstairs during hot months, descending to ground level rooms during cooler periods. These larger houses sometimes had separate sections that appeared to have been servants' quarters or spaces for extended family members. The Indus Valley people probably lived in multi-generational households, with grandparents, parents, children, and possibly married sons, with their families all sharing the same compound. This arrangement was common in many traditional societies, providing care for the elderly, childcare support for young parents, pooling of resources, and maintaining family cohesion. The houses were furnished simply by modern standards. There's little evidence of elaborate furniture. People probably sat on mats or low wooden stools. They slept on mats or simple beds. perhaps with wooden frames strung with rope or cloth. Storage was in pottery, vessels or wooden chests. Possessions were minimal compared to modern households, limited to what was necessary, useful, or held special meaning. Lighting came from oil lamps, small pottery vessels filled with oil, probably sesame or castor oil, with a wick made from twisted plant fiber. These lamps provided dim, flickering light, enough to see by but nowhere near the brightness of modern electric lighting. After sunset, households would have been dark, illuminated only by these small lamps and the glow of cooking fires. People probably went to bed soon after dark, rising with the dawn, their daily rhythms tied closely to natural light cycles. Heating in winter wasn't necessary in the same way it would be in colder climates, but cool nights and occasional cold snaps would have been uncomfortable. Small braziers burning charcoal could provide warmth, filling rooms with a different kind of smoke. People bundled in additional clothing and blankets, huddled around fires, endured the discomfort, knowing that within weeks the heat would return and cold would become a distant memory. The houses accumulated dirt, dust, and grime constantly. Maintaining them required endless labor. Floors needed sweeping daily, walls needed replastering periodically, drains needed cleaning, pottery vessels needed washing, textiles needed beating to remove dust and insects. This maintenance work, invisible in the archaeological record, consumed hours every day, primarily falling to women and children who performed the unglamorous labor of keeping the household functioning. Repairs were ongoing, bricks cracked, roof timbers rotted, plaster flaked, drains clogged, tools broke, pottery shattered. Every household required constant attention, constant fixes, constant patches. The houses that archaeologists excavate, impressive in their solidity and engineering, were actually always in a state of partial disrepair, always requiring work to maintain, always slowly deteriorating and being slowly rebuilt, a cycle that continued as long as the house was occupied. Privacy in these houses was limited. Sound traveled easily through walls and courtyards. Families lived in close proximity, hearing each other's conversations, arguments, celebrations, sorrows. Children grew up with little concept of being alone, always surrounded by family members, always observed, always part of the collective household. This closeness created strong family bonds, but also inevitable tensions, disagreements, personality conflicts, the friction of people living in close quarters with limited resources, all created stress that had to be managed through social norms, family hierarchies, and the simple acceptance that you couldn't escape the people you lived with. Women probably spent most of their time in and around the house. Their work, grinding grain, preparing food, maintaining the home, childcare, spinning and weaving, never ended. It was repetitive, exhausting, and largely invisible beyond the household. Men had more freedom to move through public spaces, to conduct business in the streets and markets, to gather with other men in public areas. But they too spent significant time at home, especially artisans and craftspeople who worked in household workshops and farmers who returned home after working in the fields. The house was more than shelter. It was the center of economic production, social reproduction, religious practice, and daily survival. It was where life happened, where children were born, where the sick were nursed, where the dying spent their final days. Houses were inherited, maintained across generations, connecting living families to their ancestors through the very walls that surrounded them. They accumulated memories, histories, meanings that extended far beyond their physical structure. When a house was abandoned, either because the family moved away or because the city was declining, it gradually deteriorated. Roof timbers rotted and collapsed. Walls crumbled. Drains filled with silt. Eventually, new structures might be built on top of the ruins, creating the layers that archaeologists excavate thousands of years later. Each layer represents not just architectural change, but the accumulated lives of all the people who lived there, their joys and sorrows, their mundane routines, their struggles and triumphs, all compressed into archaeological strata that archaeologists carefully excavate, document, and try to interpret. The houses of the Indus Valley tell us that these people valued order, cleanliness, privacy, and family. They invested significant labor in creating comfortable, functional domestic spaces, They maintained sophisticated infrastructure that improved their quality of life. They created homes that were more than just shelters from the elements, spaces that supported complex social lives, economic activities, and the full range of human experience. Food defined existence in the ancient world in ways difficult for modern people in wealthy countries to fully appreciate. Obtaining enough calories to survive, ensuring adequate nutrition, managing food supplies through seasons and years, these concerns occupied enormous amounts of time, energy, and mental space. For Indus Valley people, as for all pre-industrial peoples, food security was never guaranteed. Harvests failed. Storage methods were imperfect. Preservation techniques were limited. One bad year could mean hunger. 2 bad years could mean disaster. The foundation of the Indus Valley diet was grain. Barley and wheat were the primary crops, cultivated in the fertile floodplains of the Indus River and its tributaries. After the annual floods receded, farmers planted seeds in the moist, nutrient-rich soil. The crops grew through the winter months, taking advantage of the cooler temperatures and residual moisture. Harvest came in late winter or early spring, a crucial period when the entire agricultural workforce mobilized to cut, thresh, and store the grain before the brutal summer heat arrived. Barley was probably more common than wheat, being more drought-resistant and productive in the slightly arid conditions that prevailed in parts of the Indus Valley. Wheat was prestigious, preferred for special occasions, but barley was the daily staple, the reliable crop that kept people fed. Both were processed into flour using grinding stones, large flat stones with smaller grinding stones that women pushed or rolled across the surface, crushing the grain into progressively finer powder. This grinding was hard, endless work. A single family might consume pounds of grain daily, all of which had to be ground by hand. Women spent hours every day pushing grinding stones back and forth, their arms aching, their backs bent, producing the flour that would become the day's bread. Archaeological evidence shows skeletal damage consistent with this repetitive labor, wear patterns on bones revealing the physical cost of feeding a family. The flour was mixed with water and salt to make simple flatbreads, cooked on hot stones or clay griddles placed over fires. These breads were probably unleavened, without yeast or other leavening agents, flat and dense and filling. They were the basis of most meals, torn into pieces and used to scoop up lentils, vegetables, or meat when available. Bread making happened daily, the smell of baking bread a constant presence in Indus Valley homes, as familiar and essential as the smell of smoke from cooking fires. Beyond grain, the Indus Valley diet included various legumes. Lentils, chickpeas, beans, and peas were cultivated and provided crucial protein in a diet that was probably meat poor for most people most of the time. Legumes could be dried and stored for months, providing protein through seasons when fresh food was unavailable. They were cooked into thick stews or soups, flavored with spices, eaten with bread, filling and nutritious, if somewhat monotonous. Vegetables added variety and nutrition. Cucumbers, eggplants, gourds, and various leafy greens were cultivated in gardens and fields. These were seasonal, available fresh for limited periods, and then gone until the next growing season. People probably preserved some vegetables by drying or pickling, but preservation methods were limited. The luxury of having fresh vegetables year-round is entirely modern. For Indus Valley people, vegetable consumption was tied closely to seasons, with periods of relative abundance followed by periods when vegetables were scarce or absent entirely. Fruits were available, but probably limited to those who could afford them or grew them. Dates, a crop well suited to the climate, provided sweetness and could be dried for storage. Melons grew well in the region during appropriate seasons. Other fruits may have been cultivated in gardens or collected from wild sources. But fruit was probably a treat rather than a daily component of diet for most people. Meat was expensive, a luxury that most families consumed rarely. Cattle, sheep, goats, and chickens were raised, but they were valuable alive. Cattle pulled plows and carts. Goats and sheep provided milk, wool, and eventual meat. Chickens laid eggs. Slaughtering an animal meant losing all these future benefits, so it happened only for special occasions. religious festivals, weddings, or when an animal was too old or sick to remain productive. When meat was available, every part was used. Nothing was wasted. Organs, bones, skin, all had uses. Bones were boiled for marrow and to make broth. Skins became leather, sinew became cordage. The efficiency born of scarcity meant that the concept of waste was essentially foreign. If something could be used, it was. Fish supplemented the diet for people living near rivers or the coast. The Indus River system teemed with fish, and coastal settlements had access to marine resources. Fish could be eaten fresh or dried and salted for preservation. Fish bones found in archaeological sites show that various species were consumed, from small river fish to larger marine species. Fishing required specialized knowledge and equipment, nets, hooks, traps, but it provided protein without the cost of raising and maintaining terrestrial animals. Dairy products were probably important, especially milk, yogurt, and simple cheeses. Cows, goats, and water buffalo were milked, providing a protein source that didn't require slaughtering the animal. Milk spoiled quickly in the heat, so it was consumed fresh, given to children, or processed into yogurt and cheese, which lasted longer. The technology for making these products was simple, requiring only containers, warmth, and bacterial cultures that could be maintained indefinitely by saving a portion of each batch to start the next. Spices and flavorings made repetitive diets more palatable. Cumin, coriander, mustard seed, turmeric, and other spices native to the region were used to flavor food. Salt was essential, both for flavor and for food preservation. Salt was probably obtained through trade or by evaporating seawater in coastal areas. It was valuable, carefully managed, never wasted. Cooking techniques were limited by available technology. Boiling in pottery vessels, roasting over open flames, baking on hot stones or griddles, grilling on makeshift spits. These simple methods, used skillfully with available ingredients, produced food that was probably reasonably tasty by ancient standards, though bland by modern ones. The variety of spices and the skill of cooks would have made significant differences in how appealing meals were, but ultimately the diet was constrained by what was available, what could be preserved, and what families could afford. Water was the primary beverage, drawn from wells, stored in large pottery jars, consumed throughout the day. In a hot climate, hydration was essential, and clean water was crucial for health. The well systems in Indus Valley cities provided this, though water quality varied, and waterborne diseases were always risks. Other beverages may have been consumed, milk certainly, possibly fermented drinks made from grains or fruits, though evidence for alcohol production is limited and debated. Some scholars suggest that soma, a ritual drink mentioned in later Vedic texts, may have originated in this period, but connecting archaeological evidence to later textual traditions is speculative. Meals probably followed regular patterns: a morning meal of bread and perhaps milk or yogurt, a midday meal, the main meal, eaten after the morning's work, consisting of bread, lentils, or vegetables, occasionally meat or fish. An evening meal, lighter, perhaps leftovers from midday, or more bread and simple accompaniments. Eating was communal. Families gathering around shared dishes, using fingers or pieces of bread to convey food to mouths. Pottery plates and bowls were used, but utensils beyond simple knives for cutting were probably absent. Food preparation consumed enormous amounts of time. Grinding grain, harvesting vegetables, cleaning fish, or preparing meat, building fires, cooking, cleaning up afterward, the cycle repeated endlessly. Women bore the primary responsibility for this labor, though men and children helped, especially during busy seasons. The work was physically demanding, repetitive, and never finished. The next meal always loomed, requiring preparation, requiring fire, requiring attention. Storage and preservation were constant concerns. Grain had to be kept dry and protected from rodents and insects. Large pottery jars sealed with clay stoppers held supplies. Regular inspections were necessary to check for spoilage, mold, or pest infestations. Stored food represented security, insurance against hunger, carefully hoarded and gradually consumed, always with an eye toward whether it would last until the next harvest. Bad harvests created crises. If grain production fell short, if floods came at the wrong Time or droughts lasted too long, supplies ran out. Families rationed, ate less, gave smaller portions to children, while parents went hungry. In severe famines, people resorted to desperate measures. Eating seed grain meant not having seeds for next year's planting, condemning future harvests. Slaughtering breeding animals provided temporary relief, but eliminated future production. These choices, made under desperate circumstances, could doom communities if conditions didn't improve quickly. The social aspects of food were important. Sharing meals reinforced family bonds. Feasts marked significant events, births, marriages, religious festivals, creating memories and strengthening community ties. Hospitality required feeding guests, sometimes straining household resources, but fulfilling social obligations. Food wasn't just nutrition, it was currency, gift, obligation, celebration, mourning, and daily routine, all compressed into the simple act of eating. The Indus Valley diet was probably healthier than later diets in the region, at least for those with adequate access to food. The reliance on whole grains, legumes, vegetables, and limited meat meant lower consumption of saturated fats, more fiber, and adequate protein. Dental health was probably reasonably good, better than in later periods when sugar became common. Life expectancy was still low by modern standards, but nutrition probably wasn't the primary limiting factor for those who survived childhood. Children were especially vulnerable to nutritional deficiencies. Weaning from breast milk to solid food was a dangerous transition. Infants required more calories relative to body weight than adults, but had smaller stomach capacity, meaning their food needed to be calorie-dense and nutritious. Malnutrition during early childhood stunted growth and weakened immune systems, making children more susceptible to disease. Many children didn't survive to adulthood, and inadequate nutrition was often a contributing factor. The endless work of feeding a household, the constant vigilance required to ensure supplies lasted, the worry about harvests and storage and seasons, all created background stress that shaped daily life. Food wasn't something you picked up at a store. It was something you grew, processed, preserved, protected, and rationed, always aware that next year might be harder, that next harvest might fail, that the thin margin between sufficiency and starvation could disappear in a single bad season. And yet, within these constraints, people found ways to make meals special, to celebrate with extra food, to share with neighbors, to create moments of abundance and pleasure even in a world defined by scarcity. The food itself might have been simple, but the social context of eating, the rituals and traditions surrounding meals, gave them meaning beyond mere nutrition. Getting up in the morning in an Indus Valley city meant stepping into a world of work. Nearly everyone worked. Children, as young as 5 or 6, helped with household tasks or learned crafts from their parents. Adults worked from dawn until dusk, with brief breaks for meals and rest during the hottest part of the day. The elderly continued contributing as long as they were able, performing lighter tasks, providing childcare, offering advice and knowledge accumulated over decades. Work wasn't something you did until retirement. It was life, continuing until physical incapacity or death ended it. Agriculture dominated the economy and employed the majority of the population, though not necessarily the urban residents of places like Mohenjo-Daro or Harappa. Farming required enormous labor, especially during planting and harvest seasons when entire communities mobilized. The annual flooding of the Indus River, while beneficial for depositing nutrient-rich silt, also required careful timing. Fields had to be prepared after floods receded, plowed quickly to take advantage of moisture, planted before the soil, dried completely. Plowing was done with simple wooden plows pulled by oxen or water buffalo. The farmer walked behind the plow, guiding it through the field, breaking up soil, creating furrows for seeds. It was hot, exhausting work, with the sun beating down, dust choking lungs, muscles aching from the effort of controlling the plow and managing the animals. A man might plow for hours, stopping only when the heat became unbearable or when the animals needed rest. Planting followed plowing. Seeds were scattered by hand or placed individually in furrows, then covered with soil. This work required care and judgment. Plant too deep and seeds might not germinate. Too shallow and birds would eat them. The spacing mattered, affecting how plants competed for nutrients and water. Experienced farmers developed intuition for these details. Knowledge passed from father to son, refined through generations of observation and experience. Once planted, crops required monitoring. Weeding was constant. Invasive plants competed with crops for nutrients and water, reducing yields. Weeding was often assigned to women and children who spent hours bent over fields, pulling unwanted plants, piling them for removal or burning. It was tedious, back-breaking work, necessary to ensure healthy crops. Irrigation supplemented natural rainfall and flood moisture in some areas. Simple canals directed water from rivers or wells into fields. Managing these irrigation systems required coordination, especially when multiple farmers shared water sources. Disputes over water allocation were probably common, requiring mediation and enforcement of community norms. Water was life. Control over water was power. These tensions shaped social relationships and community politics. Pests threatened crops constantly. Insects devoured leaves and grains. Birds ate seeds and ripening crops. Rodents invaded fields and storage areas. Farmers used various methods to protect crops: scarecrows, noisemakers, guards. During critical periods, but losses were inevitable. A particularly bad year for pests could devastate harvests, creating food shortages that rippled through communities. Harvest was the most critical period of the agricultural year. Everything depended on successfully gathering and storing the crops before they spoiled or were consumed by pests. The entire community participated. Men cut grain with sickles, gathering armfuls of stalks. Women and children bound the stalks into sheaves. Sheaves were transported to threshing floors, open areas where grain was separated from stalks through beating or by having animals walk over them. Threshing was dusty, exhausting work. Workers beat grain stalks with wooden flails or drove animals in circles over piles of stalks, crushing them to release grain kernels. Then came winnowing, tossing crushed material into the air, allowing wind to carry away lightweight chaff, while heavier grain kernels fell back to the ground. This required skill, timing, understanding of wind patterns. Done wrong, you lost grain. Done right, you had clean grain ready for storage. Harvest time was exhausting, but also celebratory. The successful completion of harvest meant food security for the coming year, relief from the constant worry about starvation. Communities celebrated with feasts, consuming some of the fresh harvest, giving thanks to gods or ancestors, reinforcing social bonds through shared meals and celebration. But the celebration was brief. The grain had to be transported and stored. Protection from pests and moisture required constant vigilance. The work never truly ended. Beyond agriculture, urban populations included numerous specialized craftspeople. Potters created the countless ceramic vessels households needed for storage, cooking, and serving food. Pottery making required skill, knowledge of clay sources, understanding of tempers, materials mixed with clay to prevent cracking, and mastery of firing techniques. A potter spent years learning the craft, developing the hand-eye coordination needed to shape symmetrical vessels, memorizing firing temperatures and times that produced durable ceramics. Potters worked in specialized workshops, often in designated areas of cities where kilns could be safely operated without risking fires spreading to residential areas. The kilns themselves were sophisticated structures, designed to reach high temperatures and maintain them for extended periods. Loading kilns required careful arrangement of vessels to maximize space while ensuring even heat distribution. The firing process took hours or even days, requiring constant attention to maintain proper temperatures. A single mistake, overheating, underheating, uneven heat distribution could ruin an entire batch. Successful pottery was sold or traded, providing the potter with income to purchase food and other necessities. The pottery itself reveals much about daily life. Cooking pots show signs of repeated heating. Storage jars bear residues of grain, oil, or other stored materials. Serving vessels sometimes have decorations suggesting they were valued for aesthetic as well as practical purposes. All of this pottery, produced in enormous quantities, used, broken, discarded, and eventually excavated by archaeologists, preserves traces of the daily routines, the meals, the storage practices, the aesthetic preferences of people 4,000 years dead. Weavers produced textiles, another essential craft. Cotton was cultivated in the Indus Valley, one of the earliest regions to domesticate and weave cotton. The process of turning cotton into cloth was long and labor-intensive. Cotton bolls had to be harvested, seeds removed, fibers cleaned and carded to align them, spun into thread using simple spindles, and then woven into cloth on looms. Spinning occupied countless hours of women's time. They could spin while performing other tasks, watching children, tending animals, or sitting with neighbors, the spindler, twisting and dropping, drawing out fibers into thread, the motion almost meditative in its repetition. The thread accumulated slowly, eventually filling spindles, ready for weaving. Weaving was done on simple looms, wooden frames with threads stretched vertically, warp threads through which horizontal threads, weft, were passed repeatedly, building up fabric slowly. Weavers developed patterns, creating textiles with stripes, checks, or other designs that added beauty to functional cloth. Weaving required patience, attention to detail, and physical stamina. A weaver might sit at a loom for hours, back aching, fingers cramped, producing inches of cloth through thousands of repeated motions. The finished cloth was used for clothing, blankets, bags, and various other purposes. It represented significant labor investment, making textiles valuable trade goods and important markers of wealth. Quality cloth was cherished, carefully maintained, repaired when damaged, passed down through generations until finally worn out beyond use. Metalworkers crafted tools, weapons, and decorative objects from copper, bronze, silver, and gold. Metalworking required specialized knowledge, access to raw materials usually obtained through trade, and mastery of techniques like smelting, casting, and hammering. A metalworker's workshop would have contained furnaces for melting metal, molds for casting, anvils for hammering, and various tools for shaping and finishing metal objects. The work was hot, dangerous, and skilled. Furnaces had to reach high temperatures to melt metals. Casting required precise timing and temperature control. Hammering bronze into blades or tools required understanding of how the metal responded to heat and force, how to work hardened edges while keeping cores flexible, how to create shapes that were both functional and durable. Metal objects were expensive, valuable, and carefully maintained. A bronze tool might be used for decades, sharpened repeatedly, repaired when possible, treated as a valuable possession. The metalworker who created it was a respected craftsperson, someone whose skills were essential to the community, whose products enabled other work, farming, carpentry, craft production. Bead makers produced decorative beads from semi-precious stones like carnelian, agate, and steatite. These beads were used in jewelry, traded widely, and found at archaeological sites across the ancient world, evidence of extensive trade networks connecting the Indus Valley to Mesopotamia, Persia, and beyond. Creating beads required patience and incredible skill. The stones had to be shaped by grinding and drilling. Drilling holes through hard stone with copper drills and abrasive powders was slow, painstaking work. A single bead might require hours of labor. Bead-making workshops have been excavated at Indus Valley sites, revealing the techniques and organization of production. Specialists focused on different stages, some selecting and rough shaping stones, others drilling, still others polishing and finishing. This division of labor increased efficiency, allowing greater production, but it also meant workers performed repetitive tasks for hours every day. Their expertise narrowed to specific techniques rather than mastering the entire craft. Builders and masons constructed and maintained the cities themselves. This work was enormous in scope and never-ending. Buildings required repairs, drains needed cleaning and rebuilding, new structures were constantly under construction, streets needed maintenance. The citadels and public buildings required periodic reconstruction as materials deteriorated. Construction workers moved bricks, mixed mortar, laid courses, fitted drains, plastered walls. The work was physically demanding, often performed in brutal heat, with minimal safety equipment or protections. Workers fell from scaffolding, were injured by collapsing walls, suffered from exposure and exhaustion, but the work was essential, and the workers, despite their low status, were crucial to the civilization's success. Merchants and traders facilitated the movement of goods within the civilization and beyond. They transported grain from agricultural regions to cities. They imported raw materials, metals, precious stones, exotic woods from distant regions. They exported finished goods, textiles, pottery, metalwork, beads to foreign markets. Trading required capital to purchase goods, transportation to move them, networks of contacts to buy and sell, and willingness to accept the risks of long-distance commerce, shipwrecks, banditry, political instability. Successful merchants became wealthy. Their houses were larger, their possessions more numerous, their diets more varied. They had social status, influence over community decisions, access to information from distant places. But they also bore risks. A single bad voyage could wipe out capital, political changes could close trade routes, pirates or bandits could steal entire shipments. The economy functioned without coin money. The Indus Valley civilization predated the invention of coinage. Transactions were conducted through barter, direct exchange of goods, or through some form of credit system we can only speculate about. The standardized weights found at Indus sites suggest a sophisticated system of measurement, allowing precise valuation of goods. Scales were used to weigh materials, ensuring fair exchanges, preventing fraud. Trade required trust. Without enforceable contracts or legal systems we can document, merchants relied on reputation, family connections, and community enforcement of norms. Cheat someone and word spread. Future trades became difficult or impossible. Honor one's agreements and reputation improved, creating opportunities for larger, more profitable ventures. Work organized daily life, providing structure, purpose, identity. People were defined by what they did: farmer, potter, weaver, merchant, builder. These identities were usually inherited. Sons learned their father's trades. Daughters learned from mothers. Social mobility was probably limited. If you were born into a farming family, you almost certainly became a farmer. If your father was a potter, you learned to make pots. Exceptions existed, but they were rare. The work was hard, hours were long, conditions were often unpleasant, but work also provided meaning. Completing a good pot, successfully bringing in a harvest, creating a beautiful textile, these accomplishments brought satisfaction, pride, a sense of contributing to the community and family. Work connected people to their ancestors who had done the same work, to their descendants who would continue it, creating continuity across generations. And when work ended each day, when the sun set and darkness fell, people returned to their homes, tired, often aching, but having contributed to the ongoing survival and success of their households and communities. The work would resume tomorrow and the next day and the next, in an endless cycle that sustained the civilization year after year, decade after decade, century after century. We need to talk about the aspects of daily life that archaeology struggles to reveal, but that consumed enormous amounts of time and emotional energy. Family relationships, child rearing, the social networks that sustained people emotionally and practically, the informal governance systems that maintained order in communities. These elements left few material traces, but they were fundamental to how people experienced life. Family was everything. It provided identity, security, economic support, care in times of illness or hardship, and continuity across generations. Families were probably extended and multi-generational, with grandparents, parents, children, and possibly married sons, with their families all living together or in close proximity. This arrangement pooled resources, distributed labor, and ensured that knowledge and skills passed from one generation to the next. Marriage was probably arranged, negotiations between families rather than choices made by individuals. The primary considerations were economic. Could the families contribute appropriate resources? Were they of similar status? Would the union strengthen both families through alliance? Love might develop between spouses, and in some cases maybe it preceded marriage, but it wasn't the primary criterion for creating unions. Weddings were important social events, marking the creation of new family bonds, redistributing resources through dowries or bride prices, and celebrating with feasts that brought communities together. The specific rituals and customs are lost to us, with no texts describing them and archaeology providing only indirect hints through special pottery or jewelry that might have been used in ceremonies. But we can be certain weddings mattered, as they do in virtually all human societies, marking major life transitions and creating new social relationships. Children arrived regularly, probably with little control over timing or spacing. Contraceptive methods were limited and unreliable. Women likely became pregnant soon after marriage and continued bearing children throughout their reproductive years. The lack of effective contraception and the high infant mortality rates meant that women who survived childbearing age might have given birth to 10 or more children, with perhaps half surviving to adulthood. Childbirth was dangerous, perhaps the most dangerous event women faced. Without modern medical knowledge or interventions, complications during delivery killed significant numbers of mothers and babies. Experienced midwives attended births, providing what assistance they could, but their knowledge was empirical, limited by lack of understanding of anatomy and infection. Survival was partly luck, partly the mother's constitution, partly the baby's position and health. Infants who survived birth faced numerous threats. Diseases, infections, malnutrition, accidents all claimed children's lives at rates horrifying by modern standards. Perhaps 1 in 3 children died before age 5. Parents couldn't afford to become too attached to infants, knowing that survival was uncertain. This created an emotional distance that might seem callous to modern sensibilities, but was a necessary psychological adaptation to the brutal realities of infant mortality. Children who survived infancy quickly became economic contributors. By age 5 or 6, they performed simple tasks, fetching water, watching younger siblings, helping with food preparation, scaring birds from fields. As they grew, their responsibilities increased. Boys learned men's work from fathers, uncles, and older brothers. Girls learned women's work from mothers, aunts, and older sisters. This apprenticeship system transmitted skills, knowledge, and cultural norms across generations without formal schooling. Childhood, as a protected period of play and education, is a relatively modern concept. In the ancient world, children were small adults in training, expected to contribute to household survival as soon as they were capable. They played, certainly, but their play often mimicked adult work, preparing them for roles they would eventually assume. Toys existed, simple dolls, carved animals, balls made from cloth or leather, but they were scarce, made from scraps and surplus, not purchased in abundance. Discipline was probably strict. Parents couldn't afford children who didn't obey, who wandered into danger, who wasted resources, or who disrupted household harmony. Physical punishment was likely common, considered necessary for teaching children proper behavior. Modern concepts of child psychology and gentle parenting would have seemed absurd luxuries to people living close to survival's edge. Education was informal and practical. Children learned by observing and imitating adults. They learned through trial and error, making mistakes and receiving correction. They absorbed cultural knowledge, stories, songs, religious practices, social norms through constant exposure rather than explicit instruction. Literacy, if it existed at all among non-elite populations, was rare. The Indus script appears on seals and some pottery, but whether ordinary people could read or write it is unknown and doubtful. Gender roles were probably rigid, defined by biological sex, and maintained through social norms and religious or cultural beliefs we can only guess at. Men did certain work, women did different work. These divisions weren't absolute. Circumstances required flexibility, but they were strong enough to shape expectations, opportunities, and identities throughout life. Women's lives centered on the household, childbearing and child-rearing, food preparation, textile production, maintaining the home. These consumed their time and energy. They had less freedom of movement than men, less access to public spaces, less opportunity to pursue individual ambitions beyond the domestic sphere. But they also wielded significant power within households, making daily decisions about resource allocation, childcare, and the countless details of domestic management. The relationship between status and gender was complex. Elite women probably had more power and better lives than poor men. Status mattered more than gender in many contexts, but within the same status level, men generally had more autonomy, more options, more public visibility and influence. Old age, for those who reached it, brought both respect and vulnerability. The elderly held knowledge, memory, experience. They were consulted on decisions, their advice valued, their stories preserving family and community history, but they also became dependent as physical abilities declined. They couldn't work as hard, contribute as much, support themselves independently. In a society without pensions or formal old age care, the elderly depended on family support. Some elderly people were cherished, cared for lovingly by children and grandchildren, honored for their contributions and wisdom. Others became burdens, resented for consuming resources while contributing less, perhaps neglected or treated poorly. The experience of aging depended enormously on family relationships, personal history, and the resources available to the household. Death came frequently and was accepted as a natural part of existence. People died young from disease, accident, childbirth, malnutrition. They died in middle age from the accumulated wear of hard living. They died in old age from the decline of organs and systems that couldn't be treated or understood. Death wasn't hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes. It happened at home, surrounded by family, witnessed by children who learned early that life was fragile and endings inevitable. Burial practices varied, but typically involved interring bodies in cemeteries, sometimes with grave goods, pottery, jewelry, tools, items the deceased might need in an afterlife, or that symbolize their identity and status. The graves themselves provide some of our best evidence about Indus Valley people, revealing diet through bone analysis, diseases through skeletal remains, social status through grave goods, and even in some cases violent deaths through trauma, visible on bones. Mourning practices are unknown, no texts describe them, but grief is universal. Families mourned their dead, probably with rituals and customs that provided structure to grief, helped process loss, and reintegrated mourners into normal life after appropriate periods of withdrawal. The emotional experience of losing a child, a spouse, a parent was presumably similar to grief in any era. The difference was that such losses were more frequent, more expected, and communities had developed cultural mechanisms for handling them regularly. Social cohesion was maintained through various mechanisms we can only partially reconstruct. Community festivals and religious observances brought people together, reinforcing shared identities and values. Work that required cooperation, maintaining drainage systems, organizing harvests, defending against floods, created interdependence and mutual obligation. Marriages created alliances between families. Trade relationships created economic interdependence. All of these threads wove together into social fabric that held communities intact. Conflicts arose constantly. Disputes over property, water rights, debts, insults, romantic entanglements, all created tensions. How these were resolved is unclear. Was there formal legal system, appointed judges, community councils, informal mediation by respected elders? The absence of palaces or obvious government buildings suggests decentralized governance, but some mechanism must have existed to maintain order and resolve disputes before they escalated into violence. The possibility of violence was always present. Without strong, centralized authority to enforce peace, communities depended on social norms, reciprocity, fear of retaliation, and mediation to prevent conflicts from turning deadly. When these mechanisms failed, violence erupted. Archaeological evidence suggests relatively little interpersonal violence compared to some ancient societies, but it wasn't absent. Some skeletons show signs of healed fractures or wounds suggesting fights. Rare instances of unhealed trauma suggest murders or fatal fights. The social world was rich, complex, and crucial to survival. People needed each other, not just for economic cooperation, but for emotional support, companionship, meaning. The stories they told, the celebrations they shared, the routines they maintained together, all created social bonds that made life bearable despite its hardships. Humans are social creatures. We need connection, community, belonging. The Indus Valley people, like people everywhere and in every era, created and maintained these connections through the ordinary interactions of daily life, the conversations at wells, the shared meals, the cooperative work, the celebrations and mourning that marked life's passages. One of the most frustrating aspects of studying the Indus Valley civilization is the absence of readable texts explaining their religious beliefs and practices. We have no myths, no prayers, no theological treatises, no descriptions of rituals. What we have are tantalizing hints from archaeology, Figurines, seals with enigmatic imagery, the Great Bath at Mohenjo-daro, small household shrines, all suggesting that religion was important, but leaving its specifics mysterious. The most common religious artifacts are small terracotta figurines, particularly female figures that archaeologists often interpret as representations of goddesses or fertility symbols. These figurines, found in houses across Indus sites, show women with elaborate headdresses, jewelry, and sometimes exaggerated sexual characteristics. Were they mother goddesses, symbols of fertility invoked to ensure children, good harvests, prosperity, or were they something else entirely? Toys, portraits, decorative items with no religious significance? We can't know for certain, but the frequency and consistent styling suggest they mattered, that they served some purpose beyond mere decoration. The most reasonable interpretation is that they had religious or ritual significance, perhaps representing deities worshipped in household shrines, perhaps used in ceremonies we can't reconstruct, perhaps serving as protective amulets. The seals provide more tantalizing imagery. Carved from steatite, a soft stone, these seals were used to stamp impressions into clay, probably for marking trade goods or administrative documents. But many seals bear images that seem symbolic or religious. A figure seated in a yogic pose, surrounded by animals, has been dubbed the Proto-Shiva by some scholars, suggesting continuity with later Hindu deities, but this interpretation is speculative, projecting later religious concepts backward onto evidence that might mean something entirely different. Other seals show trees, possibly sacred trees or symbols of life and fertility. Bulls, especially the humped zebu bull, appear frequently, suggesting these animals had special significance, perhaps as symbols of strength and fertility, perhaps as sacred animals associated with specific deities. Composite creatures, par human, par animal, hint at mythological beings whose stories are lost to us. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-daro is perhaps the most intriguing structure. This large pool, with its careful waterproofing, sophisticated drainage, and surrounding rooms and galleries, seems too elaborate to be merely practical. Most archaeologists interpret it as having ritual significance, perhaps for purification ceremonies. The concept of ritual bathing for purification appears in later South Asian religions, particularly Hinduism, suggesting possible continuity. But we can't be certain. The Great Bath might have been entirely mundane, a public bathing facility with no religious significance whatsoever. Small shrines or altar-like structures have been identified in some houses, suggesting domestic religious practices. These might have been places where families made offerings, said prayers, performed rituals to honor ancestors or deities. The practice of household religion, maintaining relationships with divine or supernatural forces through daily devotions and offerings, appears in most ancient cultures and probably existed in the Indus Valley as well. Fire seems to have had ritual significance. Rectangular fire altars constructed from brick have been found at some sites. Fire was practical, essential for cooking and warmth, but it also held symbolic power in many ancient religions, representing purification, transformation, connection between earthly and divine realms. The later Vedic religion placed enormous emphasis on fire rituals. Whether Indus Valley fire altars represent continuity with these later practices or something entirely different remains debated. Burial practices suggest beliefs about afterlife, or at least careful treatment of the dead. Bodies were typically buried in extended position, sometimes with grave goods, pottery, jewelry, tools. The inclusion of grave goods suggests a belief that the deceased would need or use these items, implying some concept of continued existence after death. The care taken in burial, digging proper graves, arranging bodies carefully, providing grave goods, indicates that death wasn't simply the end, but a transition requiring proper ritual observance. Evidence for human or animal sacrifice is minimal and contested. Some archaeologists claim to have found sacrificial remains, but interpretations are disputed. Without clear evidence, it's impossible to know whether sacrifice was practiced, and if so, in what contexts and to what purposes. The relationship between religion and daily life was probably pervasive but informal. People likely invoked gods or spirits regularly, made small offerings, observed taboos and customs, participated in seasonal festivals. Religion wasn't separate from daily life. something practiced only in temples by priests. It was woven into the fabric of existence, shaping behaviors, providing explanations for events, offering comfort in difficult times. Without texts, we can't know which supernatural beings the Indus Valley people believed in. Were there gods and goddesses like those in later Hindu tradition? Ancestor spirits who continued influencing the living? Nature spirits inhabiting trees, rivers, animals? All of these are possibilities, all fit with patterns seen in other ancient religions, but none can be confirmed for the Indus Valley specifically. The absence of clear temples is puzzling. Mesopotamia had massive temple complexes. Egypt had enormous temples. The Indus Valley has nothing comparable. The citadel structures might have served religious functions, but they don't look like typical temples from other ancient civilizations. This absence could mean several things. Perhaps religion was more decentralized, practiced primarily in homes and small community shrines rather than monumental temples. Perhaps religious structures haven't been identified correctly by archaeologists. Perhaps Indus religion emphasized different practices that didn't require grand buildings. Or perhaps temples existed but were built from perishable materials that have left no trace. Priests or religious specialists probably existed. Every complex society has religious professionals who maintain traditions, perform rituals, mediate between human and divine realms. But without texts or clear iconography showing priests, we can't identify them in the archaeological record. They might have been part-time specialists, community members who performed religious functions while also engaging in agriculture or crafts. Or they might have been full-time professionals, supported by offerings and community resources, maintaining ritual knowledge and performing ceremonies. Religious festivals probably marked the agricultural calendar. Planting and harvest times likely involved ceremonies thanking gods for fertility and abundance, seeking blessings for successful crops, celebrating community continuity and survival. These festivals would have brought communities together, reinforcing social bonds, providing breaks from routine labor, creating memories and traditions that connected people to their ancestors and future generations. The moral and ethical dimensions of Indus religion are completely unknown. Did they have concepts of sin and virtue, divine judgment, afterlife rewards and punishments, moral codes revealed by gods? These ideas appear in many religions, but without texts, we can't know if Indus beliefs included them. We can reasonably assume that religion, whatever its specifics, provided moral framework, explaining why certain behaviors were proper and others forbidden, why misfortunes occurred, how to live rightly in relation to supernatural powers and other humans. The mystery of Indus religion is frustrating, but also liberating. It prevents us from projecting later religious concepts backward inappropriately. It forces us to acknowledge the limits of our knowledge. And it reminds us that religion, like so many aspects of human experience, is culturally specific, shaped by particular historical circumstances, not universal or inevitable in its forms. What we can say with confidence is that religion mattered to Indus Valley people. They created religious imagery. They built structures with apparent ritual purposes. They buried their dead with care. They maintained practices across generations and across their vast civilization. Religion provided meaning, structure, community identity, and connection to forces beyond human control. In a world where so much was uncertain, where disease, drought, flood, and death struck without warning, religion offered explanations, comfort, and some sense of control through ritual observance and proper relationship with the divine. The Indus Valley civilization wasn't isolated. It was connected through trade to a wider ancient world, exchanging goods, ideas, and possibly people across remarkable distances. Trade networks stretched from the Persian Gulf to Central Asia, from southern India to Afghanistan. This commerce brought wealth, raw materials, and luxury goods to Indus cities, while spreading Indus products and cultural influences to distant regions. Maritime trade was particularly important. Indus merchants sailed to Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, trading with Sumerian and Akkadian city-states. Mesopotamian texts mention a land called Meluha, generally identified by scholars as the Indus Valley region. These texts describe imports from Meluha, carnelian beads, timber, copper, ivory, possibly textiles and other goods. Indus seals have been found in Mesopotamian sites, evidence of direct contact and trade. The voyage from the Indus coast to the Persian Gulf required weeks of sailing, navigating open ocean without modern instruments or accurate maps. Merchants relied on experience, knowledge of currents and winds, observation of stars and coastal landmarks. Ships were probably relatively small wooden vessels, perhaps similar to traditional dhows still used in the region, with sails to catch favorable winds and oars for calm conditions or maneuvering near shore. These voyages were risky. Storms could sink ships, pirates might attack, navigation errors could lead ships astray, running aground or becoming lost at sea. Disease struck crews during long voyages, yet merchants undertook these risks repeatedly because the profits could be enormous. Goods purchased cheaply in the Indus Valley could be sold at large markups in the Mesopotamian markets. Raw materials, available in one region but scarce in another, commanded premium prices. Overland trade connected the Indus Valley to Central Asia, Afghanistan, and Persia. Caravans of pack animals, probably camels and donkeys, carried goods along established routes, stopping at oases and trading posts, exchanging products at each stop. This trade was slower than maritime routes, but reached regions inaccessible by sea and distributed goods into the interior of Asia. The goods traded tell us much about Indus Valley economy and culture. Carnelian beads were major exports, beautifully crafted from semi-precious stone, labor-intensive to produce and highly valued across the ancient world. These beads have been found as far west as Mesopotamia and as far east as Southeast Asia. Their widespread distribution demonstrates both Indus craftsmanship and extensive trade networks. Ivory, probably from Indian elephants, was exported to regions where elephants were absent. Ivory was luxurious, used for decorative objects, furniture inlays, personal ornaments. Its export required either hunting wild elephants or possibly domesticating them, both difficult and dangerous enterprises. Timber was exported, particularly teak and other hardwoods that grew in South Asian forests, but were scarce in treeless regions like southern Mesopotamia. Ships required wood for construction. Buildings needed timber for roof beams. Furniture required wood. Regions lacking forests had to import these essential materials, creating markets for Indus timber merchants. Textiles were probably significant exports, though they rarely survive in archaeological record because cloth deteriorates. The Indus Valley cultivation of cotton made them leaders in textile production, and cotton cloth was likely valued in regions where wool was primary textile fiber. Written references to Indus textiles in Mesopotamian texts suggest they were prized trade goods. In return, the Indus Valley imported raw materials unavailable locally. Copper and tin, necessary for bronze production, came from Afghanistan, Persia, and Oman. Silver came from Afghanistan and possibly Persia. Gold came from southern India or Afghanistan. Precious stones like lapis lazuli from Afghanistan and turquoise from Persia were imported for jewelry production. Wood from regions with different tree species provided variety for carpentry and construction. The mechanics of trade required infrastructure and organization. Ports on the Gulf of Cambodge and elsewhere on the Arabian Sea coast served as nodes for maritime trade. These ports needed harbors, warehouses, systems for weighing and measuring goods, administrative oversight to prevent fraud and facilitate transactions. The standardized weights found throughout the Indus Valley were crucial for trade, allowing merchants to agree on quantities and values regardless of location. Merchants needed capital to purchase goods, transportation to move them, and storage, facilities while waiting for buyers. Successful trade required information, knowing what was scarce where, what prices different markets would bear, what routes were safe and which were dangerous. Merchants cultivated networks of contacts, built reputations for honest dealing, maintained relationships across vast distances through trust and repeated interactions. Trade also meant cultural exchange. Merchants traveling to foreign lands observed different customs, learned foreign languages, or worked with translators, experienced different foods, clothing styles, religious practices. They brought stories home, describing the wonders and peculiarities of distant places. These stories fed imagination, expanded horizons, and connected the Indus Valley to the wider world. Foreign traders visiting Indus cities brought their own cultures, languages, goods, and ideas. They resided temporarily in Indus ports and cities, conducting business, living among locals, creating cross-cultural interactions and exchanges. Some foreign traders may have settled permanently, marrying into local communities, creating lasting connections between regions. The cultural influences flowing both directions are difficult to trace, but undoubtedly existed. Technologies, artistic motifs, religious concepts, social practices all could spread through trade contacts. The Indus weight system influenced Mesopotamian practices. Mesopotamian cylinder seals may have inspired Indus stamp seals. Ideas about urban planning, writing, religious symbolism all could have been shared, adapted, transformed as they crossed cultural boundaries. Trade wasn't just economic, it was diplomatic, creating relationships between distant societies, making them interdependent and invested in each other's prosperity and stability. Trade created incentives for peaceful interaction and cooperation. Merchants served as informal diplomats, maintaining relationships, resolving disputes, facilitating communication between societies that might otherwise remain isolated. The scale of Indus Valley trade was impressive by any measure. The civilization's products reached across thousands of miles. Its merchants operated successfully in diverse cultural and linguistic environments. Its economic influence extended far beyond its borders. This commercial success required sophisticated organization, advanced technology, skilled craftspeople producing quality goods, and merchant networks capable of operating across vast distances with limited communication and transportation capabilities. When trade functioned smoothly, it enriched the Indus Valley, bringing wealth, luxury goods, and raw materials. But trade also created dependencies. When external markets collapsed or trade routes were disrupted, the economic effects rippled through Indus society. The decline of the Indus Valley civilization coincided with disruptions in Mesopotamian trade, though whether this was cause, effect, or coincidence remains debated. Trade made the Indus Valley part of a Bronze Age world system, connecting disparate civilizations through commerce, creating a level of global economic integration remarkable for its time. The merchants who crossed deserts and seas, who learned foreign languages and customs, who risked everything for profit, these individuals were among the most cosmopolitan people of their era, literally world travelers at a time when most humans never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplaces. Around 1900 BCE, the Indus Valley civilization began to decline. It wasn't sudden catastrophe. No invasion swept through destroying cities in a single violent moment. No natural disaster wiped out populations overnight. Instead, decline was gradual, uneven, a slow unraveling that took generations. Cities were abandoned, not all at once, but progressively. Urban populations declined or dispersed. The sophisticated infrastructure, the drainage systems and planned streets fell into disrepair. Trade networks contracted. The standardization that had characterized the civilization for centuries gave way to regional variation. Archaeological evidence shows the late phase of the civilization quite clearly. Building quality deteriorated. Houses were subdivided. Large residences split into smaller units, suggesting economic decline or population pressure. Streets became encroached upon, occupied by structures that disrupted the original grid plans. Drainage systems clogged and weren't properly maintained. Squatters occupied former public buildings. The order and planning that had defined mature Indus cities broke down. Some cities were abandoned entirely. Mohenjo-Daro, once among the largest and most important urban centers, was gradually depopulated, its residents leaving for reasons we can only speculate about. Other cities shrank dramatically, retaining small populations but losing their urban character and reverting to large villages. A few sites show continued occupation through the decline period, adapting and changing but maintaining some continuity. The reasons for decline are debated, with scholars proposing various theories supported by different lines of evidence. Climate change is one prominent explanation. Evidence suggests that the monsoon patterns shifted, bringing less reliable rainfall, making agriculture more difficult. The Indus River system itself may have changed course, floods becoming less predictable or more destructive, altering the agricultural environment that sustained the civilization. Climate stress would have undermined food security, the foundation of urban life. Harvests would have failed more frequently, grain stores would have run low, urban populations would have faced starvation or malnutrition. People would have migrated, searching for better conditions, abandoning cities that could no longer support them. This scenario is plausible and fits some evidence, but it doesn't fully explain the pattern of decline, which varied regionally. Tectonic activity might have contributed. The region is geologically active, subject to earthquakes and land uplift that can alter river courses and coastlines. Some scholars suggest that tectonic events disrupted the Indus River, perhaps causing it to shift course, perhaps raising coastal areas and rendering ports inaccessible. Such disruptions would have been catastrophic for cities depending on river transport and maritime trade. Deforestation and environmental degradation might have played roles. Supporting large populations requires intensive agriculture and significant fuel wood for cooking, pottery firing, metalworking, and other activities. Over centuries, forests would have been progressively cleared, reducing timber availability, increasing erosion, possibly altering local climate and rainfall patterns. Environmental degradation is a slow poison, often not recognized until damage is irreversible. Disease epidemics could have reduced populations below levels needed to maintain urban infrastructure. A particularly severe plague could have killed significant percentages of populations, disrupting trade networks, creating labor shortages, breaking down the social organization required for complex urban societies. Without written records, we can't know if such epidemics occurred, but they remain plausible. External invasion was once a popular explanation, particularly the Aryan invasion theory, which proposed that nomadic Indo-Aryan peoples invaded from Central Asia, destroying Indus cities and displacing populations. This theory has been largely discredited or significantly modified. There's little archaeological evidence for violent destruction or sudden population replacement. Skeletal evidence doesn't support invasion scenarios. The supposed invaders didn't appear suddenly, but seem to have migrated gradually, and their arrival post-dated the major decline period. More likely, decline resulted from multiple interacting factors. Climate shifts, stressed agriculture, environmental degradation, reduced productivity. Trade networks contracted, possibly due to Mesopotamian political instability disrupting external markets. Political fragmentation might have weakened coordinated responses to crises. Population migrations triggered by these problems emptied cities and dispersed people across the countryside. The process was probably self-reinforcing. As cities lost population, maintaining infrastructure became harder. As infrastructure deteriorated, urban life became less attractive, encouraging further emigration. As trade declined, economic opportunities shrank, reducing incentives to remain in urban centers. As coordination broke down, responses to problems became less effective, accelerating decline. For people living through this period, decline probably felt like a slow-motion collapse, a gradual worsening of conditions without obvious solutions or clear causes. Harvests became less reliable, trade goods became scarcer and more expensive. Buildings weren't repaired as thoroughly, public works projects were abandoned incomplete. The state, or whatever coordinating authority existed, became less capable of maintaining order and infrastructure. Life became harder, more uncertain, more focused on immediate survival. Some people adapted by returning to village agriculture, abandoning urban life entirely, reverting to simpler, more sustainable patterns. Villages probably fared better than cities during decline, being less dependent on trade, infrastructure, and complex organization. Village communities could be more self-sufficient, producing their own food, making their own tools, living without the elaborate systems that urban life required. Other people migrated, searching for regions less affected by whatever problems were causing decline. Migrations probably occurred in waves, individuals and families leaving when conditions became unbearable, settling elsewhere, sometimes bringing Indus cultural elements with them, sometimes assimilating into local populations. The Indus script disappeared. The standardized weights and measures fell out of use. The distinctive pottery styles and seal imagery were no longer produced. The shared culture that had unified the vast civilization for centuries fragmented into regional variations. The Bronze Age urban civilization gave way to more decentralized, less materially impressive, but perhaps more resilient patterns of village-based agriculture. This transition wasn't total apocalypse. People survived. Communities continued. But the urban experiment ended. The sophisticated planning, the extensive trade networks, the standardization across vast regions all faded away. The cultural and technological achievements of the mature Indus period were lost, forgotten, eventually buried under silt and sand and new settlements. For nearly 4,000 years, the Indus Valley civilization remained unknown to modern world. The ruins were buried, occasionally stumbled upon by travelers or locals who had no context for understanding them. The vast cities of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa lay forgotten, their stories erased, their people anonymous, their achievements invisible. It wasn't until the 1920s that systematic archaeological investigation began revealing the extent and sophistication of this lost civilization. Excavations uncovered the planned cities, the sophisticated drainage systems, the standardized bricks, the intricate seals, the beautiful artifacts. Slowly, painstakingly, archaeologists reconstructed something of Indus Valley life, piecing together the material remains into a picture of daily existence. But vast gaps remain, without readable texts. We can hear Indus voices. We don't know their myths, their songs, their prayers, their complaints, their jokes. We don't know their names or their stories. We can't read their literature or understand their philosophical ideas. They remain perpetually mysterious, knowable only through what they built and made and left behind. Yet what they left behind is remarkable. They created one of the ancient world's most successful urban civilizations. They maintained it for over 1,000 years. They developed sophisticated technologies and infrastructure. They engaged in long-distance trade, connecting them to the wider Bronze Age world. They supported populations of millions through organized agriculture and efficient resource management. And they did it all without, apparently, the massive temples, divine kings, elaborate priesthoods, and military machines that characterized other ancient civilizations. The Indus Valley civilization seems to have been different, perhaps more egalitarian, perhaps more focused on practical concerns than glorifying rulers, perhaps organized through consensus and shared standards rather than coercion and hierarchy. Whether this interpretation is correct remains debated. Scholars continue arguing about Indus political organization, social structure, religious beliefs, and the meaning of their symbols. New discoveries provide new evidence but also generate new questions. The civilization that seemed so mysterious when first discovered remains mysterious, fascinating, and crucially important for understanding human possibilities. Because the Indus Valley civilization demonstrates that there isn't one inevitable path to urban civilization, that societies can organize themselves in different ways, prioritize different values, create different types of monuments and infrastructure. The absence of palaces and temples doesn't mean absence of sophistication. The lack of obvious military glorification doesn't mean lack of organization. The Indus Valley people built something unique, something that worked for centuries, something that has much to teach us about human potential and possibility. The daily lives of Indus Valley people, the subjects of tonight's journey, were lives of hard work, of adaptation to challenging environments, of cooperation and social organization, of family and community, of artistic expression and technological innovation. They were lives shaped by the same fundamental human needs and desires that shape all our lives: need for food and shelter, for community and meaning, for connection and legacy. When we excavate an Indus Valley house, we're not just uncovering bricks and drains, we're uncovering the stage where countless small human dramas played out, where children took their first steps, where families shared meals, where lovers whispered, where the old died and the young were born, where people worried about harvests and health, about children and neighbors, about the future and the past, where ordinary humans lived ordinary lives that were extraordinary simply in their shared humanity with us, separated by 4,000 years, but connected by the timeless patterns of human existence. The Indus Valley civilization fell, its cities were abandoned, its people dispersed, its culture fragmented and transformed. But it had existed, it had been real. Millions of people had lived full, complex, meaningful lives within it. They had loved and grieved and worked and celebrated. They had left traces not just in the archaeological record, but in the genetic and cultural heritage of South Asian peoples, in traditions and practices that might connect, however tenuously, to that distant past. Tonight, we've tried to glimpse those lives, to understand not the grand sweep of civilizational rise and fall, but the quotidian details, the boring history that actually constituted most of human experience. Getting up in the morning in a brick house in Harappa, walking through streets laid out in careful grids, drawing water from a well, grinding grain for bread, weaving cloth, making pots, trading beads, raising children, growing old. These are the stories archaeology lets us tell, stories not of kings and conquests, but of persistence and survival, and the quiet dignity of ordinary people creating meaning in their time and place. And perhaps, as you drift towards sleep tonight, you can imagine yourself there, in one of those cities, waking to the heat of another day in the Indus Valley, stepping out into a street 4,000 years old, joining the flow of people going about their daily business, living their lives, doing the work that needed doing, finding moments of joy and connection amid the hardships, being human in a time and place vastly different from ours, yet fundamentally, recognizably connected to all human experience across all times and places. The boring details of daily life, the ordinary routines, the repetitive tasks and familiar patterns, these are what history actually is, and in their very ordinariness they contain something profound, a reminder that we too are making history, not through dramatic events, but through the accumulated small choices and actions of daily existence, the meals we share, the work we do, the relationships we maintain, the values we embody and pass forward. The Indus Valley people understood this, whether consciously or not. They built for the everyday, the practical, the useful. They created cities designed for living, not monuments designed for impressing. They left behind evidence of sophisticated planning and communal cooperation. And 4,000 years later, we can still recognize in their traces the shared project of being human, of creating meaning and order from the raw materials of existence, of trying day after day, generation after generation, to make life slightly better, slightly easier, slightly more comprehensible. That's the real story of the Indus Valley. Not mystery and romance, but humanity. The boring, beautiful, essential humanity of people just trying to live, to survive, to create something worth passing on. And that story told through bricks and drains and pottery shards, through planned streets and household shrines and long-distance trade or goods. That story connects us to them across an impossibly vast gulf of time, reminding us that we are part of something larger, something that extends back through countless generations and forward. We hope, through countless more, the long, difficult, precious project of human civilization.